Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first plenary talk by Dr. Adriana Arreaza, who will talk about the economic perspectives of the Latin America region. Dr. Arreaza serves as the acting head of the Knowledge Department at the Development Bank of Latin America. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Andrés Bello Catholic University in Caracas and a PhD in economics from Brown University. Currently, she works coordinating the team of economists in the bank's shareholders' countries and contributes to the research publications of the organization. She's also an assistant professor at Universidad Andrés Bello Catholic University School of Economics in Caracas. She previously worked in the research department of the Central Bank of Venezuela. Before we start, I just want to remind you that you can leave a question at any point during the talk. We will try to answer the most of them possible at the end of it, in the question and answer session. Dr. Arreaza, please.
Thank you very much, Fernando. It is a pleasure to be here. And I thank also Angel Alvarado for contacting me to participate in this interesting initiative. So I'm going to start sharing the presentation. Okay. So how do we start this story? Because I want to address some of the structural challenges in Latin America. Since this is a history course, and you probably watched a lot of crime and noir series during the pandemic, and we all know that the good ones start by the end. Like many good ones, we have a crime, and we try to find the culprits of that crime throughout the rest of the series. So I'm going to present you two deep-rooted problems that Latin American countries face, and during the rest of the course, you're going to have a chance to find out and figure out the multiple causes of these two problems. So the first one is endemic to the region. The region experiences high volatility, but also low economic growth. And the second one is that besides being a low growth region, it is highly unequal. So starting with the low growth, I mean, why do we care about low growth? If we think of a measure of well-being that is a standard for economists, we think of GDP per capita. That is the income that every economy produces divided by the number of people. I mean, of course, that is an average. And the inequality talks about the distribution, but let's start with that average. And what we see in this graph is that since the 1960s, the progress in terms of the relative income of Latin American countries compared to the US has pretty much stalled. It had some improvement during the first two decades of this century, but then it stalled again. So at this point, the relative per capita GDP of Latin American countries is less than 30% of that of the US. So the average citizen in Latin America only gets 30% of the average income that a US citizen may get. Of course, there's a variety across countries, but I mean, this is pretty much the behavior that we see in most Latin American countries. And if you compare that to some Asian countries, and in this chart, we have the case of Korea. Korea started in the 1960s with less than 10% of income relative to the US, and now it has progressed, whereas Latin America still has stalled. So if we don't grow fast enough, the gap will remain where it is, or it can actually widen. And this is basically due to low growth. So the second question that pops after showing these charts is, well, what is behind such low growth? And in the case of Latin America, it is mostly related to productivity. We can decompose GDP per capita, or in this case, relative GDP per capita, that is 26% of that of the US, and ask ourselves, well, is this because Latin Americans work less than the average worker in the US, or is it because the labor productivity is lower? And when we compare both metrics, we see that it is labor productivity that is much lower. And in turn, if we further decompose what is behind labor productivity and we ask ourselves, well, is it that you wouldn't use physical capital properly, or that we don't have enough human capital? I mean, our workers are not as prepared. What we find is that it is the largest gap is mostly in terms of how efficiently we combine labor and human capital. I mean, there's a degree of human capital, there's a gap in terms of human capital, but the largest gap, it's still in terms of how efficiently we combine physical capital and human capital. And if we were to increase or eliminate this total factor productivity gap, what we could see is that the GDP per capita gap would narrow to a large extent, and the GDP per capita GDP gap would narrow from 26% to 70%. That is, the GDP per capita, or the income per capita of Latin American citizens, would be 70% of that of the US, as opposed to the 26% that we have right now. So we spoke about GDP per capita, we spoke about productivity being the culprit. So now the other question that pops is, well, what is behind productivity? And when we think about productivity, we can think about it in terms of how it is spread from this thing that we just saw in the previous charts of total productivity of the economy, and then we can think of the productivity within sectors, within subsectors, and up to the point when we reach the firm level. So when we think of firm productivity, we can think of, well, there's several sectors in the economy. We have manufacturing, we have services, we have education. So what is the problem within these sectors? Is it that the average sector is less productive, or is it that we're allocating way too many resources in the less productive sectors? And then we can continue on to different, if we go to the sector level, we can further go to the subsector level and say, we ask in manufacturing, well, within manufacturing, we have textiles, we have cars, we have planes, we have computers. What is the problem here? Is it that, you know, we're allocating way too many resources in textiles as opposed to in, say, building planes that is more productive? And finally, we reach the firm level. And here we say, well, within every subsector, what is the problem? Is it that the less efficient firms capture way too many resources, or is it that the average firm is less productive? And what we find at the end of the day is that the problem is across the board. The average sector, the average subsector, the average firm in Latin America is less productive relative to the US. And this is what we have in this chart right here, where we compare the output per worker relative to the US for different sectors. And what we see is that, in fact, there is a gap in terms of productivity in every single sector in Latin America. Of course, there are variation within sectors. Mining is the more productive sector, is very capitalized, but it is 50% of the productivity of the US. So the message here is that this is a problem across all sectors, and is to a lesser extent related to the economic structure, okay? So what explains low productivity across all industries in Latin America? Well, and this is an interesting dimension in Latin America. We have a formal sector, but we have a large informal sector, and in both sectors, we have problems. We cannot attribute everything to the lower productivity of the informal sector because, as we'll see, there are productivity problems within the formal sector as well. And if we use, in the previous charts, we use national accounts, but if we go to the firm level data and we explore what happens within, in several countries, what happens within the manufacturing sector, we also see that the problem is related to average productivity in subsectors, and that at the end of the day, the average formal firm in Latin America is less productive than the average firm in the US that we use as a benchmark. So average productivity in the formal sector has a central role. And if we try to reallocate resources from the more productive firms, from the less productive firms to the more productive firms, the contribution of that to closing the productivity gap would not be that large. I mean, we could have an 18% improvement in the case of Chile. These are the countries that we covered in the study, 10% in Colombia and 30% in Mexico. So there is a problem of productivity in Latin America, and it is related to the fact that the average firm in Latin America is less productive. On the other hand, we have a large chunk of the working population in Latin America in the informal sector and in micro establishments. And we see here that it is a problem that is across the board somehow, but certain sectors have a larger chunk of informal workers, namely domestic services and agriculture. And when we try to figure out the how the population is distributed within all productive sectors, what we find is that in Latin America, yeah, we have a large number of entrepreneurs, or pretty much the same number of entrepreneurs that than in the US, but a lot of those entrepreneurs have very small firms, and there is a large percentage of individuals in Latin America that are self-employed with low access to credit, not many incentives to invest, and they contribute little to increase productivity. Whereas there's a lower percentage of people employed in Latin America, particularly in the formal sector. And if we think of the distribution of firms in Latin America, as we saw in the previous chart, there's an even larger number of entrepreneurs in Latin America, but most of those just have very small firms compared to the US. And if we were to compare this to Europe, it would be pretty much the same result. We have a large percentage of very small firms in Latin America, and a very small percentage of larger firms. Whereas in the US, certainly you have the largest percentage of firms are small, but also you have a larger chunk of small and medium-sized enterprises, and what's even more important, a large chunk of large firms. And the importance of this is that larger firms, or firms that expanded over their life cycle, are more able to benefit from economies of scale, from access to credit and to incorporate technologies. And this is to a much larger extent than some of these small firms in Latin America, most of which are informal with no access to credit and no incentives to invest or develop technologies. And that is, of course, a drag to productivity. Moreover, we see that there is a kind of a strong correlation between informality across sectors and relative productivity. Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia have a large percentage of workers in the informal sector. And what we see is that the sectors that have a larger percentage of informal workers are the sectors that have lower relative productivity compared to the US. And I would like to highlight here the case of Peru to just sort of highlight the duality that we have in some sectors. In Peru, there was a very important development of the agribusiness. It contributes to more than a third of exports over the past 20 years. That has contributed a lot to exports in the economy. But when you notice that the relative productivity is still this low, the natural question that arises is why. And the fact is that there's a small sector that exports is very small compared to the subsistence agriculture sector, where 90% of the workers in the sectors are informal. And this is a duality, it's particularly stark in the agricultural sector in the region, where there's a lot of subsistence agriculture that has very little access to credit, to watering. I mean, they still, instead of having proper irrigation, they rely on rain. So that, of course, hinders any possible expansion in terms of productivity. So what is behind this problem of productivity in the region that we see across the board across sectors and even within sectors? Well, here, and this is something that you'll probably hear throughout the rest of the course, the institutions that mark the incentives and the relationship and the relations between firms actually are important to the process of selection of the firms that survive, the decision to innovate in new technology, and the reallocation of resources once firms are in bankruptcy and the resources are reallocated to other newer firms. In fact, in Latin America, you have the firm churn, that it's actually a contributor to productivity. It's lower than in the US, not so much because there are not many new firms, but because it is hard for firms to go out of business in Latin America. So you end up having in some sectors what they call zombie firms. So what are the institutions that model the incentives for enhancing or hindering productivity? And I'm just going to talk about a few. I'm just going to talk about competition, access to inputs and cooperation, employment, and access to financing. In terms of competition, if we look at this index that we have in this chart here, this is the Lerner index, and it depicts the markups in the region. The larger the markup, the lower your the lower the competition in the economy, because you're more able to extract profits that in a more competitive environment you wouldn't be able to do. And what we see is that the average in Latin America is higher than the average in the OECD countries or more developed nations. And that says that there is a problem with competition in Latin America. And what is the root of that problem? Well, first, there are barriers to entry. Many firms find it difficult to enter because of lack of finance, or because of all the bureaucracy you have to go through to open or close a firm. Also, the institutions that protect competition tend to be weaker in Latin American nations than in developed countries, and our trade relations within Latin America and with the rest of the world sometimes is not as fluid as it is with more developed nations. Again, these are more policies that we can think about across the board. Of course, different sectors should have different requirements. There are natural monopolies in many countries, or there are regulations such as land ownership that affect more certain sectors, such as agriculture. But in terms of the general problem of competition, we see that there are barriers within the region so that you can actually create more efficiency and productivity by having incorporating knowledge and competing within the region. Then another problem is access to inputs and cooperations among firms. And a problem within Latin American firms is that when you compare the use of imports that are used for, say, manufacturing, then to export that good or to sell it in domestic markets, what we see is that the use of these inputs is lower in Latin America. And many important inputs are have technology and embedded, or have lower cost, or are more efficient than some of the domestic inputs. And still in Latin America, we have problems to incorporate those inputs. Moreover, the service sector that is key for, keep the machine rolling, or manufacturers producing. I mean, for manufacturing, you demand electricity, you demand regulation, you demand financing. And if you have a service sector that is not as efficient, of course, that is going to reflect in the efficiency and productivity of the tradable sectors. So in terms of improving the relations between firms and their ability to use higher quality inputs, and I can also mention here the infrastructure. I mean, if you have large infrastructure gaps, that is going to hinder also or increase your costs of production. The relevant institutions as well that mediate the relations between firms and their ability to access higher quality inputs. And we can think of trade and integration to international markets, regulation in key service sectors, particularly utilities, integrity. If there's no integrity in the public sector, and firms are forced to pay bribes to get the proper permits or to be able to import goods and services, that is a loss of efficiency and thus a loss of productivity. And then we also need policies that foster value chains and efficiency gains through participation in value chains and clusters. And in terms of international trade, there's several things that affect trade costs. Your ability and trade, for trade, I'm talking about the ability of firms to export and the ability of firms to import intermediate inputs so that they can export or sell in domestic markets. And of course, one of the main costs that one thinks about when talking about trade are tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And in Latin America, over the past few decades, there has been a reduction of tariffs, but still the average tariff in Latin America is higher than in more developed countries. And of course, there are stark differences across countries as well. But there has been an important reduction in tariffs, but that is not the only aspect that determines your trade costs and your ability to compete in international markets. Are also non-tariff barriers, and there are also frontier costs. And this has to do with trade facilitation. If you have to fill out 90 permits in 16 different agencies, that is going to take some time, that is going to imply some costs, and that is going to make things more complicated for those firms that can export their goods and services. And frontier costs are still high in Latin America. The costs of customs, all the paperwork and all the permits that you need tends to be more convoluted in Latin America than in developed nations. And that, of course, is a barrier for international trade. And then there's infrastructure. These days, infrastructure costs are high in Latin America, not only to import and exports, but also to reach domestic markets. And in this chart here, we present a very cool exercise where we compare the actual speed of the main roads within each country to reach domestic markets. And we compare that using Google Maps with the speed, the average speed that you could reach in, say, the US or Spain that had great infrastructure. And what we see is that if trucks, containers could travel at the same speed in Latin America as they do in these couple of developed nations, the gains in terms of access to domestic markets would be substantial. So infrastructure definitely has a role to play, and closing those gaps. It will also be important in the region. And finally, the regulation that affects the participation in global value chains and in regional value chains. When you think of Latin American countries, when you think of Europe, they have a large regional value chains. Also, when you think of Asia or Mexico, the US and Canada, those are very powerful regional value chains. But that's about it. I mean, the rest of the countries in Latin America do not participate in regional value chains, nor in global value chains. And there's space to increase trade within Latin America, but we need to improve the regulation. And in particular, I'm going to refer to the rules of content. In order to participate in certain markets or regional markets, you need rules of origin that establish what can be subject or not to the general tariffs or the reduction of tariffs. And in Latin America, there's a myriad of these regulations that complicate life for exporters and hinder participation in regional chains, not to mention in global value chains. So there's still a lot to do in terms of trade and integration that would improve the access to inputs and the ability of countries to import technology or receive investments that can increase productivity. Then we have labor markets and labor markets regulation. One of the main, and I'm just gonna jump to informality because it is a major characteristic of labor markets in Latin America. More than 50% of workers in Latin America are informal. That varies a lot from country to country. You can have over 70% in Peru, less than 30% in Uruguay, around 60% in Mexico, but it's a widespread problem in the region. And as I said before, the problem with informality is that informal firms tend to invest or don't have the means nor the incentives to invest in technologies to be more productive, or the capacity to learn within jobs to boost labor productivity. So this is a major problem in the region. But also, there are other problems. I'm going to address this further along the presentation. There's a gender gap in the labor market. The participation of women is much lower than that of men, and our markets do not make proper matches between employees under positions, and there's a high rotation of workers across employments or between employments that could be a signal that matching is not very efficient. So what policies can we think about to address these problems? Well, the employment, this is a really hard topic because striking the proper balance of protecting workers, but allowing the labor markets to function more efficiently is hard. It's not, a recipe that can be copy pasted in all countries. I think all countries must, work it out by themselves according to the conditions that they have. But if you have a large informal sector and your protection policies, namely hiring a worker or firing a worker, is extremely difficult or costly, you're going to create incentives for more informality as opposed to for more formal workers that have social protection and then can have access to better jobs, better wages, and also training within jobs. So that is something that needs to be addressed, but we all know that it's politically very difficult. Then the wage setting policies. If you set minimum wages too high or above productivity, you're going to create incentives for more informality, probably. It's not that you can't have minimum wages policies, all countries do, but you have to be careful, especially if you have a large chunk of the population in informal jobs. And then the contributions to the social protection networks, if you set them too high for formal workers and then informal workers don't pay, but they receive benefits, you end up taxing the formal sector and subsidizing somehow informal workers. So you have to strike a balance there, and possibly, some researchers go to that level, creating a minimum pension, for instance, that is independent of the workers condition between formality and informality, and thinking about the unemployment insurance as something that you would pay for, but maybe not the pensions, and have the pensions as part of other type of taxation. That is just an idea that has been pushed forward by some researchers in Latin America, particularly Santiago Levy, but it addresses a part of the problem. And finally, we need a better labor intermediation to reduce the asymmetries of information of firms and workers to participate in the labor market and promote in-job training. So these are policies that can be thought for the entire economy. These are an across-the-board issue, but also within sectors, you can have differentiated policies. I mean, for instance, in the agricultural sectors, the ability of hiring workers during the season, during when you grow crops and stuff, that is a different relation with workers than what you would have in a factory or in the service sector. So you have to be able to be flexible and admit that different sectors will have different demands and needs for the relations to come up with a better relation between workers and firms. And finally, access to finance. The problem is that Latin American financial markets are shallow as compared to developed countries. The credit relative to GDP in Latin America is about 50%, whereas it is in OECD countries is 150%, almost 200% in the US. Their spreads in Latin American countries are higher than in other nations, and that relates, and to a certain extent, not so much to imperfections within the market, but also with the volatility of the macroeconomic volatility of Latin American countries that tends to be higher as compared to other developed nations. And finally, the access to credit or to a bank account is much lower in Latin America than in other countries. And of course, if you have a large chunk of people with no access or no knowledge of how credit markets function, that is also going to affect how firms operate and how firms can get access to credit. So one needs to improve the regulation, the bankruptcy laws, for instance. If you have access to credit and bankruptcy laws are convoluted, which is the case in Latin America, the recovery rates are going to be lower. So the incentives for banks to lend to new businesses are going to be lower. On the other hand, something that has improved in Latin America to a large extent to protect financial stability are the macro-prudential and micro-prudential regulations for the banking sectors. And this is because we had so many banking crises in the past that we learned something from that. So, but that means that banks are very prudent in terms of allocating credit, and that tends to affect the newer firms, and still our venture capital markets are inexistent. I mean, in many countries. So still, we need to develop financial markets to bring access to credit to new firms and to existing firms in order to allow firms to innovate and invest. So Let me, in the few minutes that we have, let me address the other problem that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the problem of inequality. And of course, low growth and inequality are related. And as I said, the informality problem can be one of the links between these two problems. So saying that Latin America is unequal, it's something that we all know. It comes to no surprise. I mean, if you draw the income distribution out of the for the entire economy, we see that the 50% of poor individuals have access to just 10% of the total income and just 1% of wealth, whereas the wealthier 10% of a population have access to 55% of the annual income in countries and 77% of wealth. So these numbers are quite sobering. But if that weren't enough and we wanted to think of the evolution of another metric that is quite standard to measure inequality, the Gini coefficient that measures the concentration of income in countries, we see that Latin America is more unequal than any other region in the world. The higher this index, the more concentrated income is, so the more unequal societies are. And what we see is that during the first few years of the last decade, when we had a rapid growth process, inequality also improved, meaning that the increase in incomes, and this was pretty much related to wages, the workers with lower wages, the increase in their earnings was proportionally larger than the increase that high earners had. So the growth process that we had in the beginning of the century was pro-poor, to put it in those terms. But those gains pretty much stalled, and still Latin America continues to be one of the most unequal regions in the world. And moreover, inequality is just not a photograph. Inequality is deep-rooted in social mobility or the lack of social mobility. And when we think of social mobility, we can have different approaches to it. We can have absolute mobility or relative mobility. And for instance, if you don't have any mobility during, say, a growth process, I mean, there's no growth because everyone, in terms of different metrics, in terms of income, in terms of years of schooling, in terms of the type of occupation that they perform, the parents' generation, the children generations are pretty much in the same position. Whereas you can have absolute mobility, but no relative mobility between generations. And what this means is that if you have absolute mobility, this is pretty much the tide rising for everyone, okay? You have more years of schooling across the board, everybody gets more education, everybody earns more because education helps with improving your path of incomes in life. But in terms of the social scale, you could still be pretty much in the same position. The ones that had parents on top of the ladder are still on top of the ladders, and the children with parents at the bottom of the ladder will still be at the bottom of the ladder. So that is a case where you can be better off because you have absolute mobility, but relative to the scale, the social scale, you're pretty much in the same place. And you can have a case also where there's no absolute mobility, but there's just a reshuffle of whatever income there is in society. I mean, the size of the pie is the same, but it gets redistributed. So some people are better off and some are worse off. And of course, this is not an ideal situation. A sclerotic society is not an ideal situation. This is a better situation, but what we want to have really is that across generations, you have absolute mobility, so everyone is better off, but that people are able also to improve their relative position in society according to their talent and their effort. So this is the situation that we would all want to have, but what we've seen in Latin America over the past few years is perhaps something closer to this than to this. There was some improvement, but things have pretty much stalled in recent years. And what are the mechanisms that can perpetuate these mobility or immobility? One of them is, of course, education. And in terms of years of schooling, there has been a massive effort in Latin America to improve schooling. And if you think of the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, most 80% of people did not graduate from elementary school. And today, that is about 5%, just 5% of people do not complete elementary school. That's a massive gain in terms of schooling and education in Latin America, and that has been an important achievement in absolute terms. But in relative terms, if you think about, well, who graduated from high school, who went to college, then what you have is that depends a lot upon the education that your parents have. So in terms of schooling, still that relative improvement was not that large. And in fact, just looking at these numbers, 88% of the children with parents with at least high school also completed high school. So, and on the other hand, 81% of the children that did not complete high school are from parents who were dropouts. So still, if your parents were more educated, chances are that you're going to be more educated. If your parents did not have a lot of education, your chances are that you're not going to have a lot of education as well. Okay, this is, of course, on average. We all know people that had better education than their parents, but on average, this is the case. So the relative mobility in terms of education was not that significant as compared to the absolute mobility. And on the other hand, who are the college graduates? If your parents had a college degree, your chances are much higher that by 24 or 25, you're going to have a college degree as compared as if your parents did not have not even a high school degree, okay? Your chances of going to college if your parents didn't have a high school degree or just a basic education degree are much smaller compared to your chances of having a college degree if your parents have a college degree. So again, this is a mechanism that replicates the situation in terms of education from generation to generation. And moreover, not only you're more likely to have this kind of education that your parents have, but you're also more likely to be occupied in something similar than your parents did. If your parents were professionals or had a high complexity occupation, you're more likely to have a high complexity occupation than if your parents had a low complexity education. So the labor markets also work this way because there's a lot of networking, and depending upon the city where you were born, the family where you were born, your education, the job opportunities that you have will mimic somehow the job opportunities that your parents had. And if you have persistence in education, if you have persistence in the type of occupation that you have, what is going to end up happening is that your income is going to be very persistent across generation, and this is quite stark in Latin America. What this says is that the best predictor of your income as an adult is the income that your parents had. This is something that happens in most countries. It is in Europe and Central Asia and North America. It is an important predictor, but in Latin America, it is by far the most important predictor. Moreover, this sort of inequality, this replication of inequalities in terms of income, education, or occupations is even starker for certain groups and locations in certain countries. For instance, women have advanced in terms of schooling, but they're not getting better jobs. Female participation is 30% lower than male participation in labor markets. Earnings for women are 35% lower than for men. And this mostly relates to the fact that women work fewer hours, have different occupations, and wages are 5% lower for women. But a big chunk of this is actually explained by the fact that women work, not that they do not work at home, but that's another issue, but they work in the labor market fewer hours than men. Then Afro-descendants and indigenous groups show also less mobility in education compared to white groups. And there are still barriers in labor market that further condition access to better jobs. And if this weren't enough, according to a poll that was developed by CAF, your zip code also matters. Like 45% of respondents up to this poll still live in the same neighborhood where their parents resided, and 34% live in the same house. And of course, if you're born in a place with limited opportunities for jobs, where access to where better jobs are is costly, you're more likely to have a lower quality job in this case. So these mechanisms of perpetuation of inequalities across generations even work to a larger extent or more acute within certain populations. And why do we care about inequality? Why do we care about the fact that we want children to have better access to health, schooling, occupation, and income and wealth accumulations than their parents did? Well, this is part of the social contract of many nations. You want equity of opportunities. Just, you can think about it for just moral reasons, but that also has an impact on growth. If you have low access or unequal access to opportunities in education and labor markets, talent is not going to be properly allocated, and that will affect growth. And in turn, a low growth and unequal society could be fertile ground to, the loosening of the social cohesion or the breaking up of the social cohesion, and that could affect political and institutional stability that would in turn affect growth and equity. So there's no easy solution for this, but what you would want is for try to attack these mechanisms of replication of inequalities in terms of the accumulation of human capital, in terms of the labor opportunities, and in terms of wealth accumulation throughout the entire life cycle of people. And in terms of human capital, what we find is that less wealthy families have restrictions to invest in children's human capital. These could be financial, but also aspirational. If your parents have a certain occupation or a certain status, you're likely to want to replicate that, and that is not necessarily true for everyone, but that could be a barrier. Then restricted choices of education depending on the place of residence. If you live in a small city or a remote place, the quality of the education and the access of education that you can get is going to be very different to that. The type of education that you can access in a city or in a wealthy neighborhood. And in terms of the quality of that education, if you look at PISA tests in the region, what you find is that there's a socioeconomic gap in terms of the results that you find for children of a higher socioeconomic status compared to children of lower socioeconomic status. They tend to perform better. So it's just not a matter of access to education, but the quality and the pertinence of that education that matters. And also the family structure. Sometimes the ability to educate children will depend on the family structure, and sometimes the teenage pregnancies can affect that. So the policies to try to tackle these issues would be to reduce the restrictions to invest in human capital, the financial restrictions, improve the supply, coverage, quality, and pertinence of education at all levels. This would be an important equalizer, and improve access to key inputs for education, particularly in more vulnerable areas. The infrastructure in certain schools and remote places is actually quite poor, and access to digitalization in many schools is also low as well. So that is something that needs to be worked on. Then labor markets. We need to have more functional labor markets to reduce the persistence of informality and create better insurance mechanisms, such as unemployment insurance that is actually quite limited in Latin America. You need to create incentives for training within jobs, better intermediation services, which is something that we mentioned before, but also non-discrimination policies that affect some more vulnerable groups, and also think of the social protection and the social regulations so that we don't create more incentives for informality and tax formality. And finally, in terms of wealth accumulation, financial knowledge is important to understand better ways to save, to get insurance mechanisms, to get access to credit, but also inheritances are one of the mechanisms that help, of course, replicate the wealth persistence that in terms of inequality that we see between generations. So we have to think about progressive taxation on inheritances and progressive taxation in general. This, of course, is a thorny issue because you do not want to overtax people and reduce incentives for savings, but there's space in Latin American countries for a more progressive taxation, and also think about inheritances. Then financial education and financial inclusion. If you don't even know how to save or utilize a bank account, it's hard for you to accumulate wealth. And finally, one of the mechanisms to accumulate wealth in Latin America, and it's through housing. And sometimes you don't even have a property title on that housing, and that is something that needs to be also addressed and regularized. And these are the final comments. I think I'm a little over time. I thought I was going to finish before, but I took all the time I was given. So inequality and growth are these two deep-rooted problems in the region that we still see and we've had for centuries. And throughout this course, you'll have time to address some of the culprits of this situation. I just addressed a few of them. Both problems are interrelated. If you have low productivity, you have low wages, and if you remain in the informal sector, you don't have access to technology, you don't have access to credit, and you have limited knowledge about the opportunities that you may have in terms of occupations, but also wealth accumulation. And finally, there's no silver bullet to solve these problems. There's no recipe, there's no cookie cutter. Institutions may condition the play field across the board, but they're not only specific on sectors or vulnerable groups. Each country has a different situation that has to be addressed differently. And policies, of course, should be designed accordingly, involving all critical actors to create a proper consensus, because some policies are not easy to move forward, and taxation, for instance, is one of them. So we have to create the awareness of some of these problems and why they're problems in our societies, to be able to set the proper consensus to address them with the right policies. And I'm just going to stop here because I already 5 minutes ahead. So
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Adriana, for the interesting presentation. We have 10 minutes for questions and answers, so we have a lot. So I apologize beforehand because we don't have time to ask all of them. But let's start with informality. So there are many questions regarding what definition of informality is. Is it just lack of economic agents not paying taxes, lack of access of social security for the economic agents? What is informality?
yeah, there are two definitions of informality. One that is related to not paying taxes and not receiving the benefits, the social benefits, and the other one is related to the size of the firms. I mean, some countries consider that firms smaller than 5 workers are informal. That is many times the case, but not necessarily in all cases. I think the more proper definition of informality, and the one that we use is more related to the fact that they don't pay taxes and workers do not receive social benefits.
Also related to this question is that many people ask, is it not informality itself caused by lack of economic growth?
Yeah, there's a link, of course, because if you don't grow fast enough, you don't create new jobs. Actually, during economic cycles, what ends up happening is that informality goes down, but informality goes down because you create more formal jobs, not because the informal jobs disappear. So in proportion, you create more formal jobs, but there's still the chunk of informal workers in absolute numbers tends to remain stable. I mean, of course, there's certain mobility from informality to formality. And I mean, during lifetime, people move from one to the other. But of course, if you grow, it is more likely that you create more formal jobs than if you don't grow.
Other people ask, would not decreasing labor regulations be the same as basically legalizing informality?
Well, it depends what you think of. I mean, what you think of regulation. If you make it very costly to hire someone, and moreover to fire someone, you're going to create incentives not to hire someone formally. If you charge a lot of benefits, there are lots of payroll taxes, there are lots of contributions that firms have to do. If you hire a formal worker, you're going to be tempted to hire informally. And that actually happens in some countries by formal firms. They're going to hire informally, I mean, or have some sort of informal contracts or relations with workers in order to avoid all, the payroll taxes and all the costs related to formally hiring someone. So when you have that, you see that the private sector is trying to do something to overcome a restriction. So that is quite telling of the fact that maybe your labor regulation is hindering formality and promoting informality.
Related to productivity also, exactly how do we measure productivity?
Okay, so it's a residual, okay? You try to come up with a measure of capital adjusted by depreciation, by the use of capital. I mean, I'm talking about the general economy. And then you measure the number of hours worked, you measure the number of people employed, you take into account their human capital to come up with a measure of human capital and capital. And then you have total output, and what you cannot account by capital and labor, you call productivity. It's a it's a residual, but it is a good measure of how, whatever cannot be accounted by factor accumulation has to come from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is how you combine and how you use productivity. This is pretty standard for all countries, and that's the way you measure that. And if you wanted to measure, that's total factor productivity, and if you want to measure output per worker, to just divide output by worker and then come up with a number of hours and then get a measure of labor productivity.
There are also many people asking about the heterogeneity in the region. Do we see some kind of better cases or worse cases?
For the sake of being politically correct, I'm just going to say that there are different cases. You see, you have the case of Mexico that I think is fascinating. Mexico is a country that is the country that its export base is the more complex, the more advanced, the more it's not related to natural resources, which is the case for many other countries in Latin America. Oil producers, metal producers, agricultural producers, or more or less diversified. But then in Mexico, that is the more complex, more industrialized country in Latin America. You have 60% of informality and moderate growth rates. And then you have other countries like Peru that is more based on its export space, is more focused on natural resources, metals, and agribusiness. And you have, over the past decade, a lot of growth, but informality remained pretty much the same, and the productivity gap remained pretty much the same. So just to mention two cases, you have, a very different scope. And then you have the Caribbean that is more focused on tourism. There are a lot of differences across and performances across the country, but across Latin America. But you have, for instance, Panama, that had rapid growth, over the past few decades, and has had a very interesting evolution. But the case is that in most countries, you still have these problems of low productivity and high informality to a larger or extent or a lesser extent. But the problems of inequality are pretty much in every country, for instance, with the exception of Uruguay and Costa Rica, that are, their Gini indexes and stuff are similar to those in developed nations, but the rest the average is not great, and there are differences, but we're in the same basket, to put it in those terms.
There are also several questions regarding liberalization or protectionist policies. One of the most frequent ones is, what is the role of exchange rates? That's a discussed topic in Latin America.
Yeah, I think a big problem with exchange rates is its volatility. If you want to have a fixed exchange rate, you're likely to, in many cases, have appreciations of that exchange rate, and at a certain point you're not going to be able to sustain it. And then there comes a big devaluation and a big BOP crisis, and that is a typical story that we've seen in Latin America. On the other hand, countries that had floats over the past 20 years were better performers in terms of preserving macro stability and not creating any type of BOP crisis or volatility in the region. Having said that, of course, in the height of the commodity boom, you had appreciations of the exchange rate that were not great for the tradable sectors other than commodities. But those countries created monetary and fiscal institutions that were able to sort of deal with that change. And when commodity prices declined after 2015, those countries were able to, manage a smooth transition to a more, or stabilized their BOP. So the exchange rate was used as a stabilization mechanism of external shocks. Whereas if you use the exchange rate, as was used in the past, but still some countries do, as a monetary anchor for inflation, if you have these external fluctuations, you're likely to run into problems when commodity prices go down, and that creates volatility along the line at some point. So I'd be more in terms of using it as a policy tool to stabilize for external shocks that you're prone to than to anchor inflation.
Okay, let's finish with this question. What is the major problem of Latin America, inequality or lack of productivity growth?
Both. Both are interrelated. I mean, if you don't grow, you have less opportunities to reduce inequality. And if you don't reduce inequality and don't grow, you know, the social fabric that, you know, keeps things together is going to erode at some point and create problems and social unrest and even institutional and political instability. So I would, if you ask me to put them in a scale, they would be in the same place.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Adriana.
Sure.
Thank you very much, all of you, all the attendees. We will continue next Tuesday with our class on early Latin American history, the arrival of Americans, and see you then. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.